We are recording and we are ready to begin. Hello and welcome back to Welty at Home, the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with works by authors connected to Welty. We are currently exploring Jesmyn Ward's novel Sing, Unburied, Sing, and during this series, we will read and discuss about 40 to 50 pages of the book each week. I am Anna Traylor, the education specialist at Eudora Welty House and Garden, and we are grateful to Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer and professor emerita of Millsaps College, for guiding these discussions. And we are especially grateful to be joined by our guest instructor for the series, Dr. Kanisha Randall Swanson, professor at Mississippi State University and author of Maverick Feminist and editor of the forthcoming Conversations with Jesmyn Ward. And she is leading our discussions of Ward's novel for the duration of the series. But first, some quick housekeeping. To comment or ask a question, click the reactions button at the bottom of the screen and select raise hand. If you're on a tablet or a phone, you may have to tap the screen here. A lively discussion often takes place in the chat as well, so be sure to glance at your thoughts every now and again. And with that, Dr.
I think Kamisha may be in class and is not with us just yet.
I'm here. I just popped in.
Oh, good. You saved me.
Sorry.
I'll let you start us off.
I am catching my breath, though. I did literally just run in, but I am, again, very excited about the way that this conversation has been going. I'm really excited about getting to these two chapters that we've made it to thus far. Not to say that a lot of action and interesting things to discuss have not taken place in the previous chapters, but this specific chapter, especially with Richie getting a new narrator in this section, and also kind of hinting at what's to come, really excites me in this particular book. If I'm being completely honest, I did not have this reaction the first time I read this novel. So this is one of Ward's novels, well, the only one really, that I had to read multiple times to actually enjoy. And I know that you all are enjoying it already, so please don't think of it as blasphemy. But the first novel of Ward's that I read was Salvage the Bones. And I connected with it so much. Which is not to say that I did not initially connect with Sing, Unburied, Sing, but I think the introduction of the spirits was a little bit different for me. Jesmyn Ward talks about how she was a very vigorous reader growing up as a child. And in one particular essay, she notes that the majority of the text that she was reading actually included magical realism. So that's what she grew up loving and enjoying. But she realized that it wasn't the most favorable genre. And she even tried to incorporate it a little bit in Salvage the Bones, but it just didn't seem to work with the rest of the narrative that she had written. So she was really excited to incorporate it here. And then we see it again in her next novel, Let Us Descend. But like she mentions, I had not grown up or even thought that I would appreciate this magical realism aspect. So actually introducing Richie, and to a certain extent Given, initially was problematic for me. But now, especially thinking about it in the context that we are for this group and thinking about this connection of past to present, it definitely is significant and very impactful and helps propel the message of the novel, of course. So there are a few points that I wanted to make, perhaps themes to share, and then I will be quiet for a moment and let you all also share your reaction. So, of course, one of the things that we see continuing in these two chapters is this kind of idea of parenthood, motherhood, and now also fatherhood as Michael joins the family once they reach Parchment. Essentially, Ward suggests that parenthood is fluid. As we see, even in this section, Richie repeats that JoJo is River's child. And of course, JoJo spends a good majority of the book trying to imitate Pop, of course. And of course, going against everything that Leonie might seem to think or hope in terms of motherhood. But ultimately, the dysfunction of their family highlights this cycle of pain, but also resilience. And I think that's important to note. But also, I want us to think about whether or not the actions that JoJo is taking to try to be this caretaker for his sister Kayla is actually thwarting some of the seemingly good attempts that Leonie is trying to make as a mother. That's just something to think about. Of course, we see more clearly how the past haunts the present, with Richie actually now not just becoming a clear character, but also a narrator. And his purpose is essentially to illustrate the importance of reckoning with one's history, because we know that just like JoJo is oftentimes hungry for literal food and also hungry for love and compassion and guidance, Richie is hungry for something as well. And the message seems to be that if we don't reckon with this past, it will continue to hunt us, but we also might find ourselves repeating it. So that's another theme that we can see, especially developing in this particular piece, in these particular chapters. But JoJo, just like JoJo and Kayla are hungry, I guess I'm kind of playing advocate for Leonie today. Leonie is hungry for something too. She feels like she's missing something. She's hungry for escape as well. And of course, one of the ways that she escapes is through drugs. But another escape is through Michael, which might also be considered somewhat of a drug in the way that she seems to be obsessed with him. But at the same time, even when JoJo mentions their interactions, it doesn't necessarily seem that she's happy with him. So that's something to think about. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about this idea of imprisonment as a whole, because of course we finally reached the Parchment prison. So one half of the journey is complete. I wanted to share a quote from a book titled The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. This is by Michelle Alexander. She states, quote, "Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you are afforded scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a Black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it." And of course, she's talking about mass incarceration. End quote. So I also wanted to note that the United States is roughly 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the imprisoned population, with over 2 million people in prison in today's time. And while African Americans make up roughly 13% of U.S. population, it makes up about 37% of the imprisoned population. And it's estimated that there are more Black people currently in prison today than there were enslaved in 1850. So that's something to think about as we're thinking about also this past bearing up on the present, and even the descriptions that Richie uses, and as well as when JoJo is reflecting upon Pop's time in Parchment, how they so much parallel with the institution of slavery. And I'll stop there to allow other people to comment. Feel free to comment on one of the themes that I mentioned. Again, magical realism, hunger, parenthood, mass incarceration, or others.
I want to add one other to that list, Kamisha, and that is the whole question of storytelling as it comes in to play here. So.
Sure.
All right. Does anyone want to start us off? Anyone? Shall we talk about it chapter by chapter? Shall we take first JoJo's chapter and then Richie's chapter?
Sure, let's do that.
What about the chapter with JoJo?
What about the what with JoJo?
What about JoJo's chapter? I'm just saying. Does
Oh,
anyone
okay.
start us off? No speaking? Beverly, can I count on you?
You knew I was going to raise my hand. That's the teacher in me.
Mhm.
One of the things that I thought was sad, but also telling about the maturity that this 13-year-old JoJo has is the commentary that we see from him, in his mind about how to avoid getting hit by Leonie. He said he used to try to come back at her, and then she would slap him and keep slapping him and make him sit down on the floor in I think it was a Walmart. And so I'm sure, having had daughters and granddaughters, and they're best at giving you the side eye than boys are, I think. But I'm sure he's probably giving her some kind of side eye when she's planning on making this potion to help Kayla, and he's afraid that it will kill Kayla because in the past she made a potion for him and it ended up killing a feral cat. So, but I think that his maturity and working through that and how to handle her, how to get around being slapped in the head again and again and again. I think that was a trait that just shows how mature and how wily, I suppose, he has learned to be to survive in the environment in which he lives.
Definitely so. So the theme of fear is definitely one too that's very much prevalent in this piece, like you mentioned, not just with JoJo, but with other characters as well. And it just made me think about the passage at the bottom of actually the opening of chapter 5, where it says, Kayla growls and cries. I don't want Lenny giving her that. I know that's what she thinks she needs to do, but she ain't ma'am. She ain't pop. She ain't never healed nothing or grown nothing in her life, and she don't know. So that commentary specifically was impactful to me, but it also made me question what I thought was JoJo's maturity. So yes, he says that she made a potion and then a cat ended up dying, but I question whether or not his overprotection, his fear, is actually hindering Leonie's ability to attempt to be a mother to Kayla. What do you think about that?
Harriet?
Yeah, I guess I was going to say, I think that JoJo's position on Leonie is entirely understandable given his relationship with her. On the other hand, I think that he is harder on Leonie maybe than the reader is as the book goes on. And I'm remembering the passage where he describes the fish that she got him that he wanted, and her failure to get more than the sample food, suggesting that maybe he could feed it bread. The fish dies, and he says, Leonie, kill things. He remembers being hit by her. He is ignored by her when he's hungry. I mean, all of his position on Leonie is entirely reasonable, but it doesn't, and he's there for Kayla in the way that Pop is there for him, or that Pop is there for Richie, um, uh, but um, but it is an impediment, and we see Leonie's jealousy of Kayla's relationship with her son, and a lot of her fury with him seems to be part of that a reflection of that jealousy, that she wants a relationship with them, and she feels that he's an impediment to it. But he is um, uh, he is hard on her in a way that keeps her from being able to. I mean, I tried to look around to see whether blackberry root tea. And I did see that blackberry root tea is not recommended for children. Um, but I don't know. Blackberry tea is pretty good for adults. And this is not the only way in which he stops her from mothering Kayla. It's his readiness to be there. Kayla's expectation, Jojo is the one to turn to, that is in the way of Leonie's attempts. And Leonie herself is hard on herself. I mean, she says early in the book, when she is making gestures toward them, she says inconsistent. There's recognizing that she is inconsistent, that when it gets hard, she hands Ayla over to Jojo. So I think we can have some sympathy for Leonie's desires, and also for the way in which she understands her feelings.
At one point, he looks at her, at Leonie, Jojo does, and he sees Pop. He sees Pop's profile, and there's a moment's doubt. He has a moment's doubt, and then it's gone.
Right.
But
and I think that, sorry, go ahead.
No, you.
No, I was just going to say, thinking about this idea of fear, that scares him also, because he doesn't want to see Pop, because Pop is all the things that he sees right and straight and rooted, and he wants to have these negative thoughts about Leonie. So if she's similar to Pop, then that means that he can't. So that frightens him for the moment.
Well, what about the drugs? I mean, for a moment, Leonie thinks, oh, she shouldn't. She's debating whether she should go out with them on the porch and do the drugs. And then Misty convinces her, and she behaves not like a mother. I mean, she seems, but this is from Jojo's perspective, to be jealous of Michael's interest in the children.
Yeah, I think I made a note about Misty, and maybe wrote a question like, could Leonie have actually handled this trip or made this trip without Misty? Because Misty seems to be pulling all the strings. But this is supposed to be, of course, Leonie's trip. So that talks again about kind of this role that Misty plays, not only as privilege, but also the negative relationship that she and Leonie have. She seems to be constantly forcing her, almost as if Leonie is her puppet in these particular places. So yeah, she's the mastermind of the trip, even though it's supposed to be Leonie's trip. And I think that serves an interesting purpose as well.
So Leonie's immaturity in acquiescing. Anything else about this chapter?
There's some interesting comments in the chat I'd love to point out. Adrian mentioned that Jojo has definitely undergone parentification, which is a really good word that I think is circulating now amongst people who are trying to talk about their feelings of having been a child who has to become the parent of either the child or perhaps even the parent in certain moments. And then Valerie says the chapter begins with details about hunger and suffering, and then the realization that healing requires knowledge. We get knowledge through stories, and we can seek healing as nourishment through stories told to us by someone passing on knowledge to us. Those are two functions of storytelling, knowledge and healing. And Liz wondered if he was even needed on the trip. She seems like a bad influence. I agree.
I think the whole idea of storytelling is really interesting here. So we're reading a story, Ward is telling us a story, but in the story, storytelling is crucial to understanding of experience. And JoJo uses storytelling
Mm-hmm.
with Kayla, the story of the rabbit that burrows through and comes out at home. And then he doesn't want to think about the other implications of that story, uh, burrowing under the ground. And I think the whole idea of storytelling is a way of understanding experience, of giving shape to experience. That pop stories for JoJo and JoJo's stories for Kayla, and then in the next chapter, Richie's stories are going to be really important. The whole idea of storytelling, it seems to me, uh, the novel is affirming that notion that storytelling is a way we make sense of our experience.
I know we talked about in previous weeks, especially the first week, about Ward's writing in general, the language use. I was just curious about you all's thoughts on the language use in in JoJo's chapter, in chapter 5, especially how she describes the environment as they are traveling, but other places where she's using descriptive language. Are there any particular passages that stood out for you?
Yeah, good question. Anyone want to comment on the language of the chapter?
I thought I saw Harriet's hand go up, but it might have gone back down.
Harriet?
I did have my hand up to talk about storytelling, and then Suzanne, you said everything that I was thinking.
Mhm.
Although there maybe there's something more to say about Pop's the way in which the book is comments on Pop's storytelling and the way in which he can't tell a story through. Ma'am says, you know, he tells the middle, he tells the beginning, and we're the ones who are piecing the story together. Um, uh, and um, and then about language, I was thinking of the passage when they're at Parchment, and Kayla says, "All the birds," she says, coughs. I look out at the fields and I don't see birds. I squint, and for a second I see men bent at the waist, row after row of them, picking at the ground, looking like a great murder of crows, landed and chattering and picking for bugs in the ground. And Kayla repeats, you know, see the bird, anticipating Richie's bird in the next chapter. But the language of the language that describes the natural world is always rich in these chapters.
I was thinking there are lots of places where I think he sort of waxes poetic in a way that a 13-year-old boy couldn't, but we're getting his thoughts, and seems to me a way of trying to suggest the depth of the thought, unlimited by the constraints of language.
Definitely. That's actually almost verbatim a point that Ward has made. She talks about, of course, people are always trying to compare her writing to Faulkner's. And that was one of the faults that she said she saw in Faulkner's writing, that his Black characters specifically didn't have that depth of thought. And she made an argument that just because they might not seemingly be educated enough or mature enough to to have these ideas or these thoughts, as you mentioned by Richie, doesn't mean that we fully understand their internal dialogues and what they might be thinking in certain situations. So the fact that she's kind of having him think seemingly more mature or more intellectual than he might be for his 13 years is very intentional.
You know, I doubt that he would know the expression "a murder of crows," for instance. That's it's a very useful uh, image, a noun of aggregation, as Brewer's Dictionary phrase and fable would have it. Yeah. Kathy, did you have something to say?
Yes, I found some writing that I really enjoyed. It's in the JoJo chapter, and I think it's important because it segues right into Pop's experience. I try to sleep, but for hours I can't. All I can do is lay there and listen to Kayla breathe. Outside, somewhere far away, off in the dark reaches of the woods, a dog barks. It's a hacking sound full of anger and sharp teeth. At the heart of it all, fear. And then he talks about how he always longed for a dog. And then beautifully it segues into the whole Parchment experience and Pop's experience as a dog handler. So I really enjoyed that. I think it's just so beautiful the way it all melts, one thing melts into another.
I agree. And that's also part of the issue with when we talked about that during the first week, where the time period is sometimes questionable because, like you said, past does bleed into present so seamlessly, and vice versa.
A lively discussion in the chat is occurring about Misty and drug use and Leonie and drug use. So Adrian points out that it seems as though Misty has been an addict for much longer than Leonie and is correspondingly more quote unquote functional as an addict. And Liz is wondering why it is difficult for Leonie to accept food and drink from the people that they are visiting, especially considering when drug use will be happening later on in these scenes, where Lisa points out that this might be something to do with pride and being considered charity. And then there's also a sense of weakness and immaturity to play and a part with that. This last comment here, interesting. Rachel mentions that this refusal pride reminds her of Annie Boatwright in Bastard. So that's not something, but it takes on mothering and survivalism and working class parenting, some class consciousness things like that. So thank you everybody for that wonderful engagement in the chat.
I especially appreciate the comparison to Annie Boatwright because, similar to Lenny, I taught Bastard out of Carolina several times, but each time I've taught it, they can't look beyond her as a bad mother. And I think that these depictions of bad mothers definitely ask for more in-depth discussion, which is why I asked the question about whether or not JoJo is actually hindering her ability to be not a good mother, because if she were a good mother, she could be that regardless of JoJo. But some of the few actions that she does take, definitely he thwarts those. But yeah, I like those connections.
Before we move on to the next chapter, I want to just say there was one little detail that really struck me, and that is that JoJo does his sister's hair and puts it up in little puffs on each side of her head. And it was so touching to me that here is this young boy who does what you would expect the mother to do. And so anyway, a small detail.
I was, before we move on to the next chapter, I someone mentioned earlier JoJo wanting a dog and why Pop wouldn't allow him to have one. I just thought those that part of the story where it talks about him kind of being the master over the dogs, and of course the warden's refusal to allow that. I thought that was intriguing, and also speaks to, again, past bearing on the present, because the master essentially, I mean, the warden essentially slaves that basically Pop can't be master over anything. All Black people have ever been able to do was to slave, to be a worker. But clearly Pop is the best person for the job. It was okay for Kenny Wagner to do, even though he's notoriously escaped prison and disobeyed the law and done so many other things, whereas Pop is this upstanding person who landed himself in Parchment just for being a relative to someone who had been in a fight. I just thought that that was interesting, that he can't be the master of anything, but clearly we see that he is.
I agree. Oh, are we ready to talk about Richie's chapter? Should we? I don't want to move us on before we're ready to go there, but in response to this, Harriet, is that you wanting to talk?
Yeah, about if we're making the transition, yeah, I'm just thinking about our discussion about language, and how lyrical Richie's voice is, and my sense reading this time was how much um, it makes the novel for me. That is, I think without Richie's voice, the novel would be a very good novel. And once Richie speaks in it, this is uh, a forever novel. I read somewhere that Richie was a late addition. That is that Ward's editor suggested to her, have you ever thought um, about a section that speaks from Richie's point of view? And I know that Ward has said, that she had as it lay dying in mind, as she had when she wrote Salvage the Bones. Um, and, there's Addie's section, Speaking Beyond the Dead. Um, uh, but but here we have, and the idea of a journey to bury the dead in Faulkner, becoming a journey now that has to do with the unburied dead. Um, and um, but I'm just thinking about how beautiful his voice is, um, and how much I find, this kind of magical realism of, I hesitate to call it that because I think that Ward um, is doing something that's kind of in a class of its own in this novel, when she has um, these moments where she moves from the realism of her everyday novel to these voices um, that are supernatural, magical, but so connected to the story of the history.
Beverly?
I just wanted to point out how brilliant I think it is, how brilliantly I think she does the segue from JoJo's chapter to Richie's. I mean, we end the chapter, JoJo's chapter, with the boy looking in the window, and JoJo says he was looking at Kayla, then looking at me, the bird. She says, the boy leans into the window and blurs at the edges. He says, I'm going home. And that was the last thing I think that we heard Pop tell us about Richie and his last narrative. And then the next chapter begins with Richie telling his story. So that was, I thought, a brilliant segue.
Yeah, I'm interested in other people's responses. Kamisha was asking us how we responded to this new character, this from speaking from the dead and returning from the dead. And to me, it just transformed the book. It was I haven't read this novel since it first came out, so I'm trying to sort of recapture the sense of first reading. And I can't remember what my response was at first, but this time it was, wow. It's what you said, Beverly, that the way the transition is managed, the power of the voice. That it's like it's taking the novel to a new level. Did anyone find themselves distracted by it? Unhappy with it?
Suzanne, I can't find a way to raise my hand, so I'm going to raise my hand.
Good. Good. Let's all do that. I wish
Okay.
people had the hand raised.
To me, I'm wondering if these, I want to say ghosts, but maybe they're not ghosts. They're more present than ghosts. But they're more even alive than ghosts, are somehow connected to the unconscious, to our unconscious mind.
Kamisha, what do you think? I was going to say, Valerie, to me, I was thinking of it as almost a function, yeah, of the unconscious, but of the imagination. It's imagination added to memory.
No, I can definitely see that argument, which is why I think I asked a question in previous discussion about Given and why Leonie only sees him when she's high. But of course, we know that in this particular section, not only can JoJo see Richie, but Kayla can see him as well, even though they're having different views of Richie. And previously in the chapter, Ma'am had told Leonie, well, you know, people in our family have had gifts. So let me know if you ever see anything that seems to be out of the ordinary. And it seems to imply that Kayla and Richie has this gift that maybe Leonie did not possess because she did not take heed of all of the teachings that Ma'am tried to instill in her. Sure.
That reminds me of one other thing that I thought of after our last session, and that is the concept of a medicine bundle. Because Native American tribes often have a culture of passing a medicine bundle from generation to generation of healers. And it's all about knowledge, and it's all about, in a way, the mystery of healing and the knowledge and the knowledge about healing. And Leonie never got the medicine bundle.
Or at least not that we know.
Not
JoJo
that we know.
says he wonders if he ever gave her one. But yeah, I agree.
Something was broken somehow.
I hadn't associated that with Native American traditions, but that's great.
Yeah, they're sometimes called a gree bag as well, but yeah.
I'd love to point out a couple of other things interesting happening in the chat again. So Rachel said that she is reading this book with her freshman students. Not sure if that's high school or college freshmen, but they are very sympathetic to Leonie when she taught this novel before their judgment was fierce. And so she's wondering what factors might influence our perceptions of Leonie's goodness or badness. And she's also looking forward to hearing the group's analysis of Richie's vivid symbolism. This was also commented on by Liz, who loved the visualization of the snakes and birds. And Kathy commented on this as well, that the threads of this story are beautifully interwoven with the past and the present. So she's excited to see this continue to unfold.
I think one of the reasons that I try to read Leonie with empathy is because I essentially try to read all characters with empathy, but also because I know Ward's work and her background, and that this is essentially her purpose in writing as a whole. She often, when she was first beginning to write, she says that essentially people told her that she wouldn't be successful because writing about poor Black people in rural Mississippi is not universal, that everyone can't actually learn something from the stories that she is trying to portray or the message that she's trying to convey. And essentially she says that, yes, you can. Maybe you're not poor, Black, or Mississippi, or from Mississippi, but you've probably experienced loss or grief or even love. And essentially she just wants readers to know that these type of characters live beautiful lives, but also live fraught lives as well. And we need to be more open-minded and empathetic in general. So this is essentially why I'm able to be more empathetic for Leonie's characters.
Eudora Welty once said she never doubted that imagining yourself into lives not your own is exactly what writing fiction is. And also later, I think somewhere she says it's exactly what reading fiction is. And so I think, Kamisha, what you're asking us to do is to imagine ourselves into Leonie's life and to feel that kind of empathy for her. And I have to say, it's a hard sell for me.
I mean, I completely
But I'm
understand. I'm
trying.
actually teaching Richard Wright's native son, and we
Mhm.
know that Richard Wright intentionally wrote Bigger Thomas as a horrible character. He talks about this was intentionally his purpose. He doesn't necessarily want you to not see Bigger as a bad person, but he wants you to think about the different systemic oppressions or the microaggressions that cause him to be this bad person. So that's essentially what I'm doing with Lenny as well.
And the loss of the brother
Mm-hmm.
looms large, doesn't it? Yeah. All right. What else about Richie? Anyone want to add anything else? What about Richie's section and what it tells us about Pop?
I thought it was interesting that he continuously says he wants to tell Richie that despite his best efforts, he cannot protect Kayla because, of course, Pops fails at protecting him, even though he was trying to be a father, a big brother, and seemed to be doing all the things right. But this is also still bearing on Pop as well, which is why we never get the end of the story. I just thought that again, similarities between Pop and JoJo that Richie points out was interesting.
Yeah. Beverly, are you? Anyone want to add here to this? What we hear?
Yeah, I'll go along with that point of, Richie says he protects as River protects. I want to tell him, boy, you can't. And that when I read that, I thought actually over to Leonie, because I think that that Leonie similarly has the sense of the kind of protection that Mam um, and Pop both believe in, is doesn't resonate for her as true. Um, and and so I think that's an important line, and the book in some ways is about that, is about whether you can protect, um, and um, and and heal. Yeah.
I want somebody to help me with these lines. They're right at the end of the section. And I'll start with what you were quoting here. I want to tell the boy in the car this. Want to tell him how his pop tried to save me again and again, but he couldn't. Jojo cuddles the golden girl to his chest and whispers to her as she plays with his ear, and as he murmurs, his voice like the waves of a calm bay lapping against a boat, I realize there is another scent in his blood. This is where he differs from River. The scent blooms stronger than the dark, rich mud of the bottom. It is the salt of the sea, burning with brine. It pulses in the current of his veins. This is part of the reason he can see me, while the others, excepting the little girl, can't. I am subject to that pulse, helpless as a fisherman in a boat with no engine, no oars, while the tide bears him onward. But I don't tell the boy any of that. I settle in the crumpled bits of paper and plastic that litter the bottom of the car. I crouch like the scaly bird. I hold the burning scale in my closed hand, and I wait. Help.
I have an interpretation, but I know that other people will have other interpretations. Kathy, did you want to go ahead and comment? If so, I'll hear what you have to say first.
So, Kathy, would you want? Oops, we're not hearing you, Kathy. You're muted.
Sure. From this, I took that Pop didn't have the gift. I guess reading that for some reason, to me, it seemed to be talking about who had the gift and who didn't have the gift, to see in and out of the past and the present, and who was able to arise, because a lot of the conversation was the birds saying, "Come with me, rise up, rise up." And I think Pop was doing the best he could, but he's grounded. He's of the river. He was part of the earth, and he could only do so much. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's kind of where I was going.
No, that's exactly what I thought too. Pop is essentially that dark, rich mud of the bottom. He is grounded, like you said. He's rooted. The salt of the sea, and that connecting that to this ability to see. I connected that to Ma'am. If we think earlier, in an earlier section, Pop told JoJo that he had to be balanced, and we can kind of see that Richie sees this balance in JoJo. Yes, he knows immediately that he is Pop's. I can tell that this is River's son, but also I see that there's something else in him as well, which is why he can see me and why the little girl can see me, but the others can't.
Why the salt, burning brine, it pulses in the currents of the veins.
I think that's speaking to Ma'am's cancer.
And helpless as a fisherman in a boat with no engine, no oars, while the tired tide bears him onward.
Now that part I'm still thinking about, but
I want to talk about man, because this pulls me back to the passage there that the midwife Marie Therese told me, "Ma'am, I had the seed of a gift. She herself could hear, prayed to the mothers, to Mammy Wata, and Eve, and Mary, that I could see whatever I was meant to see. Trained me, taught me. The woman who taught Marie Theresa to see, she herself could hear, could look at a woman and hear singing. If she were pregnant, she could tell her when she would have a baby, what sex it would be, might hear a multitude of voices from any living thing. The clearest voices rang over the jumble of the rest." The idea of being able to hear the voices and to see connected with Mammy Wata, the idea of a water spirit, a goddess who is associated with West African tradition, although it may be coming with a kind of merger from European stories of mermaids, and it's a complicated folklore. But the idea of water, the idea of saltwater woman, the idea of Ma'am, and the gift of hearing the voices of the universe is important.
Yeah, and I'm rereading it with you all chapter by chapter, but if I'm remembering my previous reads correct, later in the text, we will see again this kind of pull from the water that he's speaking about as well.
I was struck with the whole notion of the burning salt water, and with the notion of being helpless in a boat with no engine, no oars, that vision of desolation, of despair, of powerlessness.
I think that helplessness is because, again, he's trying to remember what has happened. How did he find himself under this tree being guided by a snake and a bird? So that's where part of that helplessness comes from, because he can't remember. He needs to almost reconnect with River in order for River to be able to face the end of the story, but for him to get a good understanding of it also.
So that River has not faced this in ways that Richie has had to,
And Wata was one of her aspects is being a snake charmer. Yeah.
I'd love to point out one more time a comment from the chat. So this came in right after Suzanne's passage. So I think it's probably more relating to the passage that Suzanne read from. But Lisa said that this passage reminds her of the last line of Gatsby. And so we beat on boats against the current, drawn back ceaselessly into the past. We strive against the waves and the current, but we can't ever make progress towards what we need and what we want. Thank you for that.
I think that's a good parallel. Jesmyn Ward actually does. She actually writes an essay. And the introduction to one of the issues of The Great Gatsby. So I think she would definitely appreciate that connection too. And it might have inspired it. I don't know.
So that the prospect here is that JoJo is going to see more fully. He's going to see
He'll learn the parts of the story that
completed without the moth holes, that more fully than Pop. Is that the prospect we see here?
Correct. You can see when Richie enters, he keeps saying, I want to tell him this. I want to tell him that. And Ma'am has already told us that Pop never tells the full story. And Richie even says, well, he always tells me this part and this part, but never that part. And it's because it is traumatic. It is not something that he wants to have to deal with, just like he doesn't want to have to deal with dogs. He can have every other animal, but the trauma that he experiences with the dogs is something that he doesn't want to have to face. And that's, again, that past bearing on the present.
Does the fact that Pop will not have a dog after this, is that significant?
Yes.
In what ways? I mean, is this Pop also repressing the full knowledge of what's taken place at Parchman?
Exactly. And I don't want to say more because I don't want to give away other parts of the narrative, but yes.
All right. Anything else in these two chapters? Valerie?
Yeah, these last comments sort of are leading me to say something that maybe is too personal here, but I am having disturbing dreams that are related to reading this book. And I say that just because I think this book is so much about our imagination, our unconscious life, and yet dealing with some really grievous injuries that are currently in our lives now, have been in the past. I just wonder if you all are experiencing that too. To me, it's having a big impact on me and on my unconscious mind.
Yeah, I mean, that speaks to the power of the novel. Harriet?
I didn't have my hand up, but I certainly agree with that.
I saw you on the top line too.
Yeah. No, the novel is, this is a very powerful novel. And I give myself to it. Yeah.
I'm thankful I haven't had the dreams, Valerie, but I do
Right.
it's had that effect upon me, the powerful effect, and I do find Richie to be the sort of character that has the most powerful effect upon me. All right. Any final concerns with these two chapters? Alicia, is there something else you think we should talk about before we close?
I mentioned the bird and the snake, but I'm just curious about people's reactions to this part. So, of course, we get Richie, who is, I guess, essentially a ghost. But also we have these magical kind of mythical animals as well. I know that a good bit of the story is about animals. But what were you all's reactions specifically to the snake and the bird that becomes this vulture?
There's been some interesting conversation about that in the chat. People are paralleling this imagery with Suzanne Novel's prequel novel to the Hunger Games, The Battle of Songbirds and Snakes, which also draws on natural world and mystery. And Sally also is reminded about Jesmyn's brother in this circumstance as well.
The description of the snake and becoming the bird is an amazing description. So when he wakes up and he sees the snake, so when I saw a white snake, thick and long as my arm, slither out of the shadows beneath the trees, I knelt before it. You are here, it said. The needles dug into my knees. Do you want to leave? It asked. I shrugged. I can take you away, it said, but you have to want it. Where? I asked. The sound of my voice surprised me. Up and away, it said, and around. Why? There are things you need to see, it said. It raised its white head in the air and swayed, and slowly, like paint dissolving in water, its scales turned black, row by row, until it was the color of the space between the stars. Little fingers sprouted from its sides to grow wings, two perfect black scaly wings, two clawed feet pierced its bottom to dig into the earth, and its tail shrunk to a fan. It was a bird, but not a bird, no feathers, all black scales, a scaly bird, a horned vulture. It bounced up to light on the top of the youngest pine tree where it bristled and cawed, and the sound raw in that silent place. Come, it said, rise. I stood, one of its scales dislodged and floated to the earth, wispy as a feather. Pick it up, hold it, it said, and you can fly. Oh, that's just an amazing description. What are we to make of that, do you think? Anyone offer me guidance here?
Do you mean in terms of the description or just what's actually taking place?
Yeah, the whole notion of the white snake become the black bird, I think, becomes the black scaly bird, the notion of flight, freedom, seeing things you haven't seen before. I'm wondering about where the origins of this imagery and the implications of it symbolically, I guess.
I know when we think of course, whiteness, oftentimes it's compared to purity. And the snake is sometimes thought of as protection. I remember, and I'm going to not quote her correctly, but I remember her saying that she was trying to basically turn this image inward. So transforming from this thing that seems pure and seems to be related to purity and protection to this idea of death is what we usually think of when we think of the vulture. But it's this black vulture that can actually lead Richie to remembrance, that can lead JoJo to understanding, that can lead Pop to healing. So again, this idea that you have to deal with death in order to move on in your present and future.
And hearkening back to the first pages and the references to death there. Certainly the white snake is a telling image, I think, there.
Lisa points.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Lisa pointed out in the comments that Richie kneels before the snake, which leads to his flight and freedom, lending to a religious element there. And Adrian is reminded in the passage that Suzanne read of the end of Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon.
The end of
Toni Morrison.
Song of Solomon.
Oops. 11:50 or yeah, 12:59. Gosh, sorry, 12:59. So if there are any more final comments, we'd love to have now. With Deborah, go ahead.
Let's give Kamisha the last word.
No, I was just thinking that I love that this text, especially these two chapters, have caused us to ask more questions than we actually have the answers to, because that means that we're thinking critically about the things that are taking place. Many of them, like I said, especially Suzanne, some of the questions that you were asking about the water and the mud will be answered in later chapters. But in general, I like when something that I read leaves me with more questions than I actually have answers to. That means you're engaged, you're intrigued, that it's being an impact on you. So I have appreciated hearing and attempting to answer some of your questions.
I'm going to quote Eudora Welty again when she says, great fiction has everything but a clear answer. And I think when we move into this notion of the magical realism and the whole idea of mystery and the unconscious mind, we're going to be left with mystery ultimately. There are not going to be clear answers. Great fiction, though. Yeah. All right. I suppose we're done. We'll see you next time. 2 more
See
times.
you all next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kamisha.